McMaster's history begins in 1963, and McMaster University was already an existing university, but they didn't have a medical school. So in 1963, the president of McMaster University, which was Harry Thode, decided that he wanted to open a new medical school at his university, which is in Ontario, a province of Canada. And it was the 60s, so there was quite a lot of money available and also a willingness to do things a bit differently. So Harry Thode himself didn't have any idea of what he wanted to do different in this university, just that he was willing to accept change. So he nominated Dean John Evans to be the founding dean of the university. And John Evans was a medical doctor from Toronto University. And Evans was very young, actually, comparatively to the norm for deans at the time, and a man very much willing to embrace change. So the first thing that John Evans did was nominate a team around himself of equally motivated and relatively young colleagues of his from Toronto University. And they all had in common that they had not really enjoyed their own medical education, which was heavily lecture-driven, discipline-oriented. And so, because they had this small medical school that they needed to build up and could experiment with, they were given the green light to do something different. Now, quite what that was, they didn't have a specific idea of when they started. So what they did is between 1966 and 1968, the team of the 5 of them went actually traveling around North America to look at ideas and inspirations for what they could do. And they came across several examples that inspired them to reconsider traditional medical education pedagogy. And one of the most prominent things that they discovered is that the Harvard Business School had been using case studies for some time, in fact, since the 1920s. And this method of the Harvard case method, as it was applied in business, not as it was applied in the law school, but this was inspired by a method developed by an American philosopher called John Dewey, which was called the problem method. Now, there is a major difference, of course, between what these guys brought home to McMaster and what the case method was about. Namely, that at Harvard, people would study at home and then come to class and discuss a case. At McMaster, people started with a class discussion and then went to study. So you can see it's inverse compared with the case method of Harvard. Another thing that McMaster did was they traveled to an institution called Western Reserve University, and that was in North America. And what that university had that was special was that in the 1950s, 1952, they reformed their medical curriculum and they got rid of disciplines and departments. So the whole idea of using these interdisciplinary units came from Western Reserve University. And one of the founders of McMaster admitted that they just borrowed this idea wholesale. And another thing that they saw at the time, because they began hiring people, of course, to start filling in the ranks of their faculty, and they hired a lot of British professors. And these British professors, quite a number of them, had been educated at Oxford and Cambridge. And they brought to the table something that has been a core feature of the Oxford and Cambridge model for centuries, which is called the tutorial system. Now, in Oxford and Cambridge, the tutorial system is a one-on-one supervision system, but partly for financial reasons, because they didn't have this sort of endowment that Oxford and Cambridge had, so they couldn't afford one-on-one tuition. Partly for ideological reasons, because one of the founding fathers thought that the Oxbridge system, as it's called, was a bit too paternalistic. They decided to have groups of 4 or 5 people with one tutor. And so with all these ideas together, they debated them, and they had 2 years to start preparing this program. It was not actually John Evans who designed PBL. It was his colleague Bill Spalding, who really developed the nuts and bolts of what this PBL program would look like. And they first opened in 1969 with 29 students. Now, the things you have to bear in mind here then, if the core lessons, are that this was chiefly driven by pragmatism. They were looking for a better way to do medical education. The sort of political context that was present at Berkeley and in some other more revolutionary institutions around that time, 68 in particular, was absent from McMaster. I mean, sure, these people were radical in their way of changing medical education, but they were not politically radical. And that's quite important to note for the rest of the story.
Mm-hmm.
And PBL carried on developing on a sort of trial and error basis from 1969 to 1972. It was a 3-year program, because in America, medical school is a graduate program, so you've already got a bachelor degree by the time you go into medical education. And its key features when it started was that it was small groups, as I said, that worked in interdisciplinary units, using problems as the start. They had some lectures, but really very few, and there was no assessment. So they had no exams at all. And that program was later co-opted and transformed by 2 people who had a lot of influence on the development of the history of PBL at McMaster, who were called Howard Barrows and Vic Neufeld. But that didn't really happen until the mid-70s. So that's sort of the beginning of PBL at McMaster.
Mm-hmm.